All right. So, hello, everybody, and very good afternoon from a warm and sunny Muscat, Oman. And I'm super excited to start off with our first Roots and Roots Adda series for the year 2025. And I must say, I feel so privileged, so honored, and so happy to have a very dear friend of mine, Michiel Baas, a fantastic anthropologist, a writer, a traveler who received his PhD from the University of Amsterdam, worked precisely as research fellows in National University of Singapore. He was a lecturer with the University of Amsterdam as well. And most importantly, he's a fascinating writer. Not only writes like long books like novels, but he also writes regularly for various prestigious news platforms about politics, about society, and most importantly, a very significant part of Michael's research work is the question of the mobilization of the body. And today, actually, we will talk quite a lot about it in the perspective of migration, in the perspective of masculinity, in the perspective of muscularity. And very essentially, I must say that he has written a fascinating book in 2020. It's called Muscular India. I believe many of you already have gone through it, at least have come across reviews. But if you haven't, I'm sure Michael is going to show us. Fantastic. That's exactly the book. It's an amazing work. You must look into it. There are so many layers. It's complexly layered, but one thing I want to flag off is it's such a fresh and essential lens to look into the new urban middle class of the 21st century India. Surely we will touch on it. But Michael, a warm welcome into the space. How are you keeping?
Right. Really good to see you again.
Great, great. So, to start off, I was wondering that I would like to start off with a very basic question, like even before getting into this very elements of muscularity and masculinity and its connection to Indian politics and the middle class and all of these elements. You have been working on the question of body for quite some time, right? Like on the question of the mobilization of the body, which is not just in terms of the physical mobilization, but also in terms of the emotional mobilization, in terms of the metaphysical mobilization, and so many multiple dimensions you have been working on. So I think it would be very interesting to know from you that what are some of the factors? I mean, if you can share, maybe they can be personal factors, they can be collective factors that sort of provoked you to work on this question or the perspective of the mobilization of the human body.
Oh wow. Well, that's quite a question to start off with. Um, I think I have to go back to a particular moment in time when I was starting to think about it in the Indian context more broadly. Um, I'm basically a migration scholar. I've been doing various migration projects over time. I've been a guest in India for many years, and at some point, I started noticing in the Indian urban space a rapid growth of fitness centers and on lampposts and elsewhere advertisements for bodybuilding competitions. And as it usually happens with me as an anthropologist, these things don't immediately interest me. They just kind of susurrate in the background. And I'm typically a walker, so I walk a lot in Indian cities. I must be the only one, but I really enjoy it. And kind of sort of by walking, you see things, you start noticing things, and this was one of these things I started noticing, and it ran somewhat parallel to a couple of movies which were also increasingly putting the spotlight on the Indian male body. And these were Om Shanti Om with Shah Rukh Khan, but also Amir Khan's Tamil adaptation of Memento, Gajini, and a couple of others. And for some reason, that seemed to very quickly take a hold of Bollywood and then later of regional cinemas like Hollywood and Tollywood, etc. But initially, it was very much a Bollywood thing. And you would suddenly get these movies where the male body had to be unveiled. in specific moments within these movies. So Shah Rukh Khan taking off his shirt and revealing his freshly baked abs, and obviously in Gajini, Amir Khan constantly flaunts that body. And having been coming to India at that point already for a decade, I hadn't really seen that before. And as an anthropologist, then that question starts kind of developing in my head. Okay, what is going on here exactly? Like, why is this now? Why do I see all these gyms here suddenly? And to backtrack a little bit, a lot of my work from the very beginning has been on new middle class formations in India. So if you'll allow me to continue for a bit longer, I once held a job in a small bookstore at the Central Station in Amsterdam. I'm originally from the Netherlands, and I was doing my bachelor in international management at the time, a very different time. And slowly we were approaching 1997, which, as everybody knows, is the year that India celebrated 50 years of independence. Now, you need to see me also here a bit position myself. An anthropologist does that all the time. I am a white male, Dutch in origin, born and brought up in rural Netherlands. That's who I am. But I was also interested in the world. And India was one of these places I was interested in, but didn't know much about. Now, you need to picture me in this bookstore surrounded by magazines and journals and newspapers, which have all gone out of print since because of the internet, but it wasn't there yet. And they were suddenly talking about India and the next millennium or the next decades, what is to come. And they were suddenly putting the spotlight on a rapidly changing India that I did not know anything about. So this kind of already was a foundation in my research work, a fascination I had to understand how is India specifically changing within all that, these big words of a new India, of a changing India, of rapidly changing urban landscape. And a lot of these magazines actually worked like these were Time, The Economist, and they all worked with sort of stereotypical ways of capturing that. They would insert an elephant in it, and then people working on computers in the IT industry. So I was trying to penetrate that for a while already, and I think the muscular body was an element that I hadn't quite been able to predict, but that suddenly presented itself to me in the urban India, and I wanted to know more about it.
Awesome. I think this is such a fascinating narrative that you shared, Michael, especially like two very interesting dynamics converging with each other. On the one side, you were talking about, your experience of walking across and around the country and observing the very influence, the big influence of the muscularity that was promoted and advertised by the Bollywood. And I think it's so relatable because I do have these very interesting experiences. Like there was a time when I thought of hitting the gym, which obviously did not work for me well. And it was very interesting for that very short period of time. I used to work out in the gym where I would see that prior to, you know, like people going to the marriage receptions and all, on that one morning they would come to the gym to pump their body and they look muscular, so that in the evening when they go to the marriage their arms look very masculine and muscular. So that always fascinated me, like why people would just come in the morning to pump their body up and make them look like very muscular in the public spaces. And I think it was also the question of class as well, because when I thought about it deeply, it was a specific class of people who were sort of so much attracted towards this sort of representation or these sort of identity representations.
Yeah.
And obviously, I didn't have a very clear picture until unless I read your book, Muscular India, which enabled me to tie a lot of these interesting dots. And then a very interesting perspective that you share with your time in 1997 in, working in the bookshop amidst books and articles and journals, which were gradually going out of print. And then you see, you have your own understanding and representation of India, that which kind of also, I believe, enables us to understand your development of interest in the cultures and the narratives and the perspectives of this country. And this also sort of provokes me to ask you and go to the next question is, obviously in your book you do talk about a lot about the influence of the Bollywood in our lives, especially in shaping the new urban middle class. And absolutely, in terms of hairstyles, I have never understood it from the muscular perspective, but long before I can say imitating hairstyles or imitating glasses that we are wearing. So in fact, I have no problem in admitting that as a kid, because I got my glasses at a very young age, so I would like to sort of mimic some actors who would wear these very thin lensed glasses in the movies, and I found them very attractive. And hairstyles, obviously, for sure. So I mean, even prior to this culture of muscularity being a perspective of presenting or shaping a certain kind of identity, Bollywood always had this influence in our lives, in our perspectives, in terms of style statements. And in that context, I would like to know that when you were writing this book, Muscular India, you share a lot of your ethnographic and autoethnographic experiences of visiting the traditional gyms, akhadas, and also visiting the Western gyms. So, maybe a very core question that through the lens of the representation, the creation of muscularity and the representation of masculinity, do you see that the how do you equate? Do you see that there was a kind of the intention of representation in the akhadas and the intention of representation in the Western gyms are kind of different when people try to carve their body, when people try to shape their body, or when they are performing all of those theatrics and the expressions in the process of building up their body? Do you see an intention of difference in these two spaces?
Yeah, to a certain degree. I mean, this is a question that's really has kind of sort of followed my research because it's one I get a lot. That doesn't mean it's not an original question. I think it's a very important one. Like, what is the relationship between this newly sculpted body that you see on the cover of my book, basically this one, and that of the Akada, and for instance, the one that Joseph Alter writes about extensively. And obviously, yeah, to a degree, these are very different, and it touches upon something that I think is crucially sets it apart, is that the wrestler's body in the end is needed to successfully fight somebody in the ring, whereas a bodybuilder generally mainly fights against himself. A bodybuilder is on stage, needs to show off, and is then kind of judged on the basis of what he displays there. Of course, he's compared to others, but it is in the end, the fight is with his own body to shape and mold it in a certain way. I think that stands in direct relationship to what has become an attractive norm for men around the world, which is that of the lean muscularity. But again, the lean muscularity isn't necessarily what a bodybuilder requires to be successful on stage. The lean muscularity is something that you see a lot of Bollywood stars also, chase after. And it's more, the easiest way to think of that lean muscularity is what you see on the cover of Men's Health magazine. So it is less ostensibly enormous. It really shies away from any reference to the use of hormones, growth therapy. It is not necessarily only meant to be as large and enormously muscular as possible. There is a thin line that needs to be found there in how that body can look, and when it looks too big and too vascular and too muscular, and it no longer is seen as attractive. And I think what makes that particularly interesting in the Indian case is where, for instance, these men who would frequent the akhadas in the past, certainly among an older generation, kind of your parents' generation of middle-class Indians, would think of that as kind of a Gunda-style body, kind of an underworld. So one of the things that I found particularly interesting in that momentum of Om Shanti Om when Shah Rukh Khan starts donning six sort of abs and biceps, and it is that he displays a very specific type of muscularity that diverges a little bit from that. And because he was always the quintessential middle class hero, in that sense, quite different from Salman Khan, who always had a very much broader kind of working class appeal and could get away with kind of a Gunda look. Shah Rukh Khan never did that before. When he did that, it provokes people to think about a muscularity that could be middle class as well. And that was a seismic shift in Indian styling and comportment, that this body, in that sense, this specific body could be a middle class accomplishment. And that's also where my work ties in with these questions of socioeconomic difference, because to go back a little bit to that momentum in 1997, when the world, for the first time, in a sense, was being exposed through large publications like Time magazine on the idea that India was emerging economically and was playing an increasingly larger role in software development. That was a very new thing. We've often forgotten about it. It was the world was heading towards the millennium bug disaster. Our students now, at least mine, I'm 50, were all born after the millennium bug disaster, but it was solved in Bangalore, right, by IT companies here. So the world was getting to know a different India, which also for me as a Dutch boy growing up, represented a very different type of India than we were used to, where India was either impoverished. I know it's not a nice thing to say, but it's the kind of thing that we would get out of our limited TV. Don't forget the Netherlands also had its own Doordarshan, so we had two channels to choose from. It was one or two, and it was usually our parents who would choose which one. So we would get very limited exposure to the world. I think all of that was changed in 1997. It was also around the time that these magazines started talking about a burgeoning Indian middle class. And for the world, I think, but also for India, this was also kind of a new thing, because this was also a class of consumers, people with money to buy. For those kind of sort of, to me, these dates are all fresh in my mind. But of course, India had climbed out of an economic slum in 1991 with economic liberalizations, where it was more or less forced to open the doors to foreign capital. And it is around this time also that India starts getting foreign products. For a while, like, this one, well, not in the diet variety, was not available in India because of that very reason. So you get this whole change where India is also figuring out what it means to be modern, new, contemporary, and all these things at the same time. And the middle class is emerging. And I think my work was always rooted into that question of what is that middle class exactly? Who belongs to that middle class? How do people self-identify that? And now you had that new complicated element of the body in that. Like you talked about it, what you described it very nicely, the mobilization of the body. I mean, until that, the body was indeed not at all mobilized as part of a middle class identity. It was, your uncle would have sport a belly, and that would probably be taken as a sign of prosperity and wealth. But the body in itself, and you saw that too in all the Bollywood movies, that the body at most is a masculine body, but not a muscular body. Of course, some of these men would be muscular. They were big, strong men. But the body itself is never really regarded as attractive or stylized. And all this starts changing in that period. And suddenly, young men, and you went to the gym at some point, go to the gym and think that they can get and acquire this body for themselves. That's where it gets really interesting.
Fantastic. And while I was hearing about the whole trajectory, and also because why I asked you this question centrally was because usually, if you look at the history, the way akhadas are portrayed, I mean, akhadas were never historically projected as a place where you get masculine and muscular. Rather, it had very strong spiritual ties. It has ties to the question
Yeah.
of health. It has ties to the question of being, being disease free. So it has a very strong sort of spiritual connection. Whereas when you look at the gym, I mean, obviously people talk about the question of fitness and gym, but there are many other elements that goes to the gym, because the this tremendous outburst of the gym culture, we cannot deny that it widely ties to the sort of influence of, widely the Hindi movies on the, on the Indian middle class community, right? And this is why I wanted to sort of understand how do you read through the intentions? And also, while I was listening to you, it also sort of made me think about, again, a lot from a personal experience. Also, I would like to say that why people are motivated to go to gym, why they want to have a muscular body. And
Mm,
also, it's not always about being um, perceived as a wannabe model or a wannabe actor, or to just mimic somebody from the Bollywood, but also, or a hero that we look up to, but also it is a way of overcoming some sort of vulnerabilities as well. Because, for instance, people subjected to body shaming because of a certain kind of body shape which is not masculine enough, or which doesn't look enough attractive for men to attract beautiful women, is what the society often let that people know through mockeries and subjugations and silencing and all of these things. And these things are kind of, I would say, at least when I was a school kid in the 90s, it was quite common to
mm,
just pass comments at somebody's body, and to kind of structuralize the male body, as if it is enough attractive to have women in life, right? And that also ties down for me to the question of vulnerability. That is where
mm,
people often feel vulnerable in terms of their existence in the society, in terms of their cultural belongingness. It can also, maybe not very directly, but for me can be tied down to the question of caste and creed as well. That is where certain people from certain caste who have been historically perceived as very weak often resorts to have muscular bodies to express publicly express their physical prowess, their physical strength. So it ties down altogether to a lot of question of vulnerability. So I was wondering, again, as a
mm,
scholar, widely working with the question of body from the migrant's perspective, from the question of muscularity, from the question of masculinity, how do you see, or how do you understand the association of vulnerability with the urge for being muscular?
mm, mm. Yeah, so I need to backtrack a little bit there because I think you already suggested it yourself, like going to the gym and what it does, how you reflect upon yourself within that context. I get that a lot at conferences where I present my work or at literary festivals. People start kind of looking around, like, am I the only one who doesn't look like that? I think part of it, that's what it does, right? So that the presence of muscular bodies in urban space, in advertisements or movements, reminds us of that our bodies aren't, in a sense, good enough, whereas most of the time they are just what they are. And if you look around closely, you see that almost nobody looks like the men I've interviewed for this project and whose lives I followed. In fact, a lot of them no longer look like that now either. They look a certain way at their prime when they post pictures of themselves. They look at their absolute fittest. But keeping that up is really not that easy. And many of the men that I followed around over time also give up on that to a degree. I mean, they always stay mindful of food because that's how they train themselves. It requires extreme discipline to become that way. Most of us not only lack that discipline, but also simply lack the motivation for that. It is really, really quite extreme. So when we see these images, and I want to guarantee people on listening in on this as well, is that keep in mind that almost nobody looks like that. So what we're looking at is a tip of the iceberg. Most people in the gym do not look like that, will never look like that. And indeed, going to the gym itself, you can ask very serious questions if that makes sense. I've given up a while back, realizing that it didn't really do anything for me. It's always good to stay mobile and active. And this is more broadly and more recently a concern I have in India whenever I take a flight in India, noticing how many people need to be put in wheelchairs. In that sense, India is heading for an enormous disaster in terms of health. And a lot of factors come together there, not just sedentary lifestyles and the availability of ready-made goods, but also the fact that Indian cities often don't allow much space for lengthy walks and for mobility. So I get it too. So I'm not judging anyone here. That I want to say that first and foremost. When it comes to I'm just thinking, because you asked me a lot of different questions, and I'm just jumping on the first one. What might motivate people to go to the gym or look like that is also, you need to think of that a little bit in terms of marketing, how the whole image and the idea of the lean muscular body at some point became hegemonic as something that could signal not just masculinity, but a highly specific type of masculinity. We often think of that body as aggressive, and I have an article coming out on this soon in the Journal of Boyhood Studies. So that I argue that actually that is really not what you should equate it with. The man I interviewed are certainly not aggressive men or feel less about themselves. As one of the things that I've extensively argued is that these are often also somewhat more liberally minded men who, for instance, when it comes to in their relationships with women and working with female clients, are a lot more open-minded than some of their clients. Partly also because they forge their own bodies through a process of transformation, which cannot do without a transformation of the mind. For those who haven't read my book, most of the men I worked with and followed around over quite a few years hail from so-called vernacular or lower middle class backgrounds. And so that new middle class, that recent middle class, their parents weren't often already middle class. Maybe your parents were and considered themselves already middle class. But these men actually generally hail from families that, think of this middle class signifier as a recent addition, sometimes due to the sale of an ancestral land, such as in the NCR, or simply because they've been upwardly mobile in economic terms. But they grow up in vernacular households. They don't speak English at home or at school. A lot of the things they acquire for themselves in that sense are all how they put their own minds to it. And in that sense, they really diverge from their fathers and their uncles, attending a gym, meeting upper middle class clients, providing training, working on their comportment, styling themselves in a certain way. As one informant always said, I can no longer go to the bazaar to buy my jeans because my clients would instantly pick up on that and would think of me as a failure. So I need to look the part. So he goes to a Levi store, an actual Levi store, to buy the right jeans. He goes to a Ferrari showroom to buy the shoes. He can't afford a Ferrari, but he can afford the shoes. So there is a lot of work going on and transformation that runs parallel to that body itself, which is a lot of work and a lot of investigating also, because there's no clear-cut way to get there. So it's a lot of trial and error. Now, the way this gets reflected on in the media is, I think, crucial here, is that especially around the time that all these movies started coming out, it's a little bit less so because it's become more common, but you get all these articles on how Shah Rukh Khan had transformed his body, what Amir Khan had done, what Farhan Akhtar had done for this Milka Bag movie, all these kind of articles would come out. And what emerges from that story is a sense of control and accomplishment. And I think that's what made that body also fashionable in middle class terms, that it isn't just a sexually attractive body and aesthetically pleasing to the eye body. And we're probably wired at a biochemical level to respond to that, like to strong joy lines, like women respond to that. That's been researched that, it all harks back to the good old days when we were all running around in loinskins and basically, had all that to base on whether a partner would make a good match to get children with. The kind of sort of that Darwinistic idea, like, you want the healthiest, best looking partner because then your kids will have the highest survival rate. We're probably still wired to a degree, and that also makes these bodies sexually stimulating, at a physical, biological level. But other than that, of course, they have absolutely no function to most people. I mean, if you look at this body, if you look at it from a laborer's perspective who might need his body to do heavy lifting or pull a rickshaw, or, none of these men have this body, this specific body. They have a very wiry body that can handle a lot of work, but they're not necessarily these aesthetically pleasing bodies. So that already diverges. So one thing that I argue in my book is also that a lot of this has to do with marketing, how this body gradually was framed in all sorts of publications where it was brought in conversation with notions of control in a rapidly changing urban landscape where you're constantly bombarded with food ads, right? And with ways of consuming and all that. So, that resonates with the idea of control, like you're in control, you're successful, you've accomplished this too. And for men, certainly the men featured in Men's Health, you see that, like especially the personal training clients, and not so much the trainers themselves, but the clients who've been able to achieve this big muscles, and on top of being successful program managers or accountants, like Dave, or businessmen, they've accomplished this too. So it becomes an add-on to the brand that is you. And obviously, now we're living in social media. There is a constant need also to show off, to show aspects of ourselves that extend beyond that. And to go back to your uncle, maybe with a pot belly, that all wasn't there at that time. So a lot of this also has to do with the fact that we've started photographing everything and posting everything. I'm from 1975, and I've seen, the camera become digital from a small roll with 24 or 36 kind of stuff, to virtually everything being captured on film. And so we're also constantly looking at ourselves. And this is, I think, also a big change globally. We're so ultra aware of mirrors, and the mirrors aren't just the physical mirrors, but also the fact that we're constantly being videotaped. And to give you an example, like I was born in 1975. There is not a single film of me being little. There are only a handful of pictures. Just the other day, I went to the Lal Botanical Gardens in Bangalore. I probably took more pictures there than were taken in an entire lifespan of me being a child, so that wasn't there. And I think this is also part of the puzzle. But when it comes to this body having an actual use, no, it is marketing. It's self-marketing. This is what you sell of yourself. And we've gotten used to, and I think in relation, and you said something which is in a sense a little bit dangerous. Not that you meant it in a dangerous way, but that we've started thinking of that as the benchmark, which it isn't. I mean, nobody looks like that. I certainly have, always struggled with keeping the weight off. Most people have. So it's not the standard, but we're constantly reminded of thinking that for some reason we could look like that as well.
No, absolutely, and very, very well detailed, Michael. In fact, what you flag off as something dangerous that I've put out, I completely agree with you. But why I shared this also, because probably that would have been my next question, but I think after this thought sharing, I'll halt a bit, and I wish also for the audience to come in and share their thoughts and processes. But just prior to that, um, there is also a reason, because when I was listening all of your responses, it just reminds me of certain images, and that ties to the question of politics as well, like where
Mm,
this question of muscularity, especially in the contemporary times. I'm not trying to reflect with a specific political party, but in general, we
mm,
have these associations of larger than life representation of political leaders, associating them with certain figures of gods. and gods who are represented as a very masculine figure, like Hanuman, like Rama.
Mm,
If you look at their representations in the images or in the temples, or their huge statues outright into the public spaces, they're actually quite muscular. And also that ties down to their representations in the soap operas as well. Like you really find the Ramas and the Arjunas as with like six packs, honestly, like six packs and very muscular. So indeed, this is dangerous because obviously, I mean, we are not trying to set this as the ultimate benchmark of being a man or of being a masculine person, but somewhere, somewhat, I do have this fear that there is this subtle push to gradually think in that particular line. And so this is the reason
mm.
why I sort of, flagged that off in my question.
Well, I think, sort of, I've been thinking long and hard, and sometimes help that I go on these crazy 8-hour walks, whether it's across Bangalore or Tokyo or Mumbai or Rio, it doesn't really matter. It gives you time to think.
Hmm.
And it occurred to me that beyond this whole idea of the muscular body, you can only fail as a human being these days, right? In light of all these successful people who constantly advertise how successful they are at every moment of the day through TikTok, Instagram Reels, and all that, on top of, our politicians doing this in a highly stylized way. And certainly, of course, movie stars, though at least with movie stars, I always think like that's their job to look like that. So I kind of take comfort in the fact that this is their actual job. But beyond that, sort of you can only fail. And I think that is what consumer society, fiercely neoliberal, that also does to all of us. We're constantly questioning. I do that as an academic and as a writer. Like, am I successful enough? Have I accomplished enough? Did I do enough? There is always somebody with a better publication, with a higher quotation, whatever you call it, citation score. There's always somebody with a bigger book, that sells more copies. So you're constantly competing out that. And I see this muscular body for a lot of Indians and also beyond, also as an outcome of that. So, the men I would sometimes also interview, they would say, well, this was my unique ability. This is what I could show to the world. And that's also what they do online. Beyond that, they have no appetite for a particular language, so they're not neuroscientists. This is what they have accomplished. And we piggyback on that because it's so primal, right? The body is so, we all have a body. So I think it's much easier to accept that we can't all be scientists and that we can't all be muscular in the same way because, obviously you have a body, so you could work towards it. And if you work hard enough, and I think that's another crucial thing in that is that it is physical work. And we think of physical work generally as simple, whereas mental work as very hard. But in my experience talking to bodybuilders, the two are very, very neatly conflated and entangled, and you can't separate themselves. And they're certainly not dumb men who only lift weights. And there's a lot of hard thinking involved in that. Now I'm trying to circle back to what you asked earlier about these gods. It's interesting how the gods in itself have undergone a transformation where, Lord Hanuman really did not. Lord Hanuman obviously was always strong because that was his duty towards Ram as a protector, etc. But a lot of the other gods don't necessarily have that as a task. Like if you look at Lord Ganesha, increasingly he's being depicted with six-pack abs, which is rather ironic considering his penchants for certain sweets and the way that is celebrated during Ganesh Chaturthi. So you do see a transformation there as well. Part of it is, of course, also influenced by superhero movies, which in particular in India have started really to compete with Marvel. So they become they become big, what do you call that, franchises by themselves. And so they need to look good. These actors need to look good. It's in keeping with the times. If you look at the older Mahabharata show, which you may have seen when you were young, I mean, the actors look very different. Obviously, Arjuna being an archer, he needs to look a little bit sporty, but others don't really need to do that at all. When it comes to politics, this is another question I get a lot. I do always think it's important to think of at least the men that I met as not necessarily equating a toxic masculinity and very staunch viewpoints on anything. And this has a lot to do with their exposure and their process of their trajectory of self-transformation, where they've learned to keep an open mind. And they're also judged, so they do know that as well. But, a lot of them don't do what their fathers ever did and had to convince their parents of the right trajectory. So they're often actually the exact opposite of toxic masculinity, I find. But you do need to understand them as also operating within all the constraints that mark life in Indian megacities, where on the one hand, you do have a lot of very, very wealthy people. You just step out on the street and, if you don't watch how you're crossing, you land under a Jaguar, which is also, so it happens now, Indian owned as a brand. But at the same time, of course, there are also a lot of people who still live on a couple of dollars a day. And that's often where their parents come from. So there is a lot of economic precarity as well. And this makes them, in that sense, very new middle class. That's what they share with a lot of people who are new to middle class lives, who want to have the same in terms of clothes, shopping, leisure, going on holidays. But I think even more so, what sets the men apart that I've worked with is not so much economic difference, but socioeconomic difference. So what sets them apart from all the middle classes is English speaking, knowing where they belong within the social hierarchy, all these kind of things. And that makes my story, in a sense, also a story of changing India. And it's my minimal contribution to kind of figure out how that works at an individual level, because that's typically what an anthropologist does.
Fantastic, Michael. Now I will surely like to invite our friends who have joined us. Please feel free to have your questions, reflections, thought processes. If you want to put out something into the chat box, you're very welcome to do that. Unmute yourself, speak, whatever is comfortable for you. Just feel free to do that. And I understand that this is a kind of topic which is not often discussed, I would say, at least in the Indian perspective. I mean, we are talking a lot about, in fact, we do have a whole study paradigm called the masculinity studies, but then trying to look into the question of masculinity and muscularity through such intersectional lenses is not a very usual thing that we, think around, right? Even when we're talking about religion or politics, we don't bring the question of muscularity a lot into our conversation. So I'm pretty sure that for a lot of us who are here, probably it will be something very new to take away and for sure quite provocative. Yeah. So at any point of time, feel free to put your question in the chat box. Not a problem, no rush. And I'm sure Michael is also very regular with his emails and all. So with due permission of Michael, can I just put your email ID, Yahoo email ID in the chat box,
Yeah,
and
sure.
let me just put it out.
Yeah, always feel free to share your research ideas and thoughts with me. I do get these quite a bit, and I'm always happy to respond. And I think, I always had the hope that my research would translate into more follow-up research on the topic, because I believe that, the body is really an important site to inquire notions and experiences of change within society. I think what I've done a lot as we wait for if questions come in, I can give you a bit of background. Like when I started coming to India in 2001 or 2000 or so, um, I offered this in broad brushstrokes. Like there were not yet a billion Indians, and there were about 5 million Bangaloreans or people living in the city of Bangalore. Now, some 20 years later, there are 1.4 billion Indians. India is now officially the largest or the most populous nation on the planet. And a city like Bangalore is now, with 15 million, the third largest city after Delhi and Mumbai. And if you look at the histories of change, which I'm particularly interested in, so over the years I've collected a lot of books on Bangalore's changing urban landscape, you see from that emerge very specific questions about kind of what does it actually mean? India in these years has become one of the most powerful nations on earth. It certainly has one of the largest consumer bases. It has some of the biggest companies, some of the biggest billionaires. What does all of that mean? Like, how do you exist amongst each other and vis-a-vis each other? And that continues to guide my work in when I think it helps that I call myself a slow anthropologist, like a slow foodie, is that I take a lot of time to sit with ideas and experiences, um, and this is, I think, yeah, where the body becomes so interesting. And earlier you were talking about akaras. I'll come to that question in a second, George. Is that even the akaras and some of the men I follow on Instagram, I can see that it has percolated there as well. So the body ideals of men who work out in the akaras has decidedly changed and become far more lean muscular than they were in the past. So in that sense, and also they now increasingly work with filming their exercises and promoting these as a more healthy alternative. So there's one guy from Delhi that I follow, and I find him very interesting. He's exceptionally lean and muscular, very strong. And he now has started trading in these typical clubs. So he has them made and he sells them across India and even the world. And he has a large following outside of India among white men who now do the kind of exercises the way the traditional wrestlers would do them. And more intriguingly, they all start with honoring the clubs in the same way. So blessing them and doing, even though they're not Hindus. So somehow that has also now become a global thing. I saw a question. Shall I just go to the question?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's a kind of a continuity of our conversation, and maybe I am happy to read the question for you, Michael. So George says that is it due to the idea of desirability of the unattainable, the body of actors are hyper muscular in Indian commercial films such as Om Shanti Om in fantasy sequels in the
Yeah.
musical part of the film?
Yeah, of course, I mean, scarcity is always interesting, things that are more expensive. I forgot the term for it, but there is a um, certain group of luxury products that actually sell less when they are priced less because of, the unattainability of it, like a Birkin bag, for instance. In this idea, of course, the scarcity helps because, like we discussed earlier, almost nobody looks like that, and almost nobody is able to look like that either, no matter how focused you are. Of course, if you do all the steps entirely right, you might. But most people give up long before that because it takes years to get there. So yes, of course, the desirability of such body due to the scarcity is absolutely what adds to its attraction. Well, the problem is with Indian commercial films is that Indian actors obviously have private chefs, private trainers, private physicians, have their entire world organized around them in such a way that this can be accomplished. This is very different from you and me, who, need to fry their own egg, do their own groceries, still have full-time jobs, to consider, kids to raise, being stuck in traffic for hours because of some flyover disruption. So, all of that stands in the way what an actor doesn't have to deal with his private gym at home, having the personal physician and etc. come in. Moreover, that person has the kind of funding for this as well, for this kind of precision engineering. And that brings us again to the scarcity. We need to be a little critical of that in the sense of how it is brought to us as an attainable goal, before we start thinking of our own bodies as not being good enough.
I don't know, George, do you have any follow-up perspectives to share? Um, Thank you so much, Michael, for your response. We have another question from Madhumita Das. She asks, how does the um, narratives in war histories add to the notion of masculinity?
So I think I can mainly answer this on the basis of the lingo itself, where men are conquering their own bodies, are slaying their bodies, are demolishing their bodies. So using a kind of a lot of the terminology as if they indeed were soldiers who went to war, who spent time in the trenches being the gym. And I do have a few papers where I talk about the social media imprint of these bodies. And there I discuss this a bit longer, also this layering of the body. So it's very important to think of when you see this muscular body, this one, with its picture here, is that when it appears on social media, it is, there are hashtags to speak about it. And when you click on this, you kind of see that it says like, I went in beast mode, or I conquered something, or I slayed it, or I survived another day, or so that kind of resonates a little bit with the idea of actually having won the war, but the war you've won is with yourself. Because at a deeper level, a lot of these transformations are about transformations of the self and working on yourself and kind of making it seem as if you've become a superior human being because of it, which I don't think so. At most, it might give you some endorphins, which make you feel better about yourself, but will make you a better human being.
Thank you so much, Michael. And I think this is a very interesting take to understand the association of the jargons of warfare with muscularity is such an interesting point that you highlighted. And it's such a part of our daily conversation, like laboring and fighting and, triggering and aiming and, all of these jargons
Yeah.
that we use. So it's quite interesting. I think George has a follow-up question. George asked, why is there a scarcity in a representation of achievable female bodies in films? They are either over-objectified or entirely unattainable or even engaged in Eurocentric standards. Why can't there be a better spectrum of representation?
Yeah, it's again an excellent question, and thank you for it. I mean, I think if you remove the final question you finish with, you see that actually increasingly male bodies are exactly as female bodies in the fact that they are unattainable and they are over objectified. You just have to look at the responses of women. I'm thinking of which is this book, Ram Leela, which had a different name in the end with, what's his name? The actor. He at some point strikes a couple of bodybuilding poses, and then literally women fade because he does that, because they find him so deliriously attractive. So I think increasingly that's happening with men's bodies now as well. And it actually has caused quite a lot of concern among doctors because eating disorders among men are really on the rise and body dysmorphia orders. Issues. So both of them kind of are meeting themselves in unattainable goals. But indeed, when it comes to the sexualization, something different is going on. And here the female body is almost always sexualized from the male gaze, but the male body, the sexually attractive male body, is generally sexualized through what a man wants to look like. It isn't necessarily the scripting of these movies generally don't actually script the stories in such a way that they're doing this because a woman has asked for it. This is a big difference. Men, certainly in India, often encounter more men in their lives and in their daily lives than women. But here it's very much the male gaze that puts this on celluloid screen, right? That fantasizes about that. And that links it to ideas of masculinity and how men want to show themselves in society. Whereas I don't think most women ever fantasize about the idea that this is the ideal type body. The discussion among women is also much longer when it comes to the idealization or fetishization of their bodies, because obviously they were always discriminated on. So when it comes to the various phases that feminist theory has gone through, this has always been a crucial debate. Like, why can't women look like women the way women do naturally? They always have to be sculpted and changed and de-haired, and their breasts aren't big enough, or when they are really too big, they need to be small, etc., etc. So it's certainly the case, but I do feel that they're converging more these days. The gaze is different, though. Women are always objectified through a male gaze, whereas male actors are generally guided by the male gaze in the ideal type bodies. And these are actually much less about what women find desirable per se. And that's also constantly what research shows, that this is not necessarily something that women desire in a man. Women generally, if you look at really dry research that has tried to map that, it's extremely hard to capture sexual attraction and desire through academic research, right? Because conditions in a lab or a situation are never the same as out on the street or in daily life. But what they show is that women generally look at men beyond that physical body and very quickly move beyond it. Might want to have a one-night stand with an attractive body, but when it comes to partners, boyfriends, husbands, it's rarely the crucial element in what makes them enter a partnership with a man. And in that sense, the whole portrayal in movies is also different. I hope that answers a little bit of your question, George.
I believe George would type something in the chat box to let us know. But meanwhile, thank you so much for this fantastic responses and questions and interactions. Um, we are running slightly out of time, so maybe we will stop our conversations here. But again, as I shared, I'm sure this is first of the quite a few series of conversations I think we can have, Michael, in due course of time, because it's such a fantastic topic to deal with and engage with, and there can be endless number of endless number of multiplications of ideas that can emerge from this topic. And you have set the tone so well out. Thanks all of you for whosoever you have joined. And I'm sure you must be having so many questions, so many perspectives to share. Take your time, sink in, think around, and at any point of time, feel free to write to Michael. The email ID is already set out here just for people, just for your convenience. It is michielbaas@yahoo.com. It's all in short letters. So write to Michael. He's available. And thank you once again, Michael, for your fascinating conversations. And this was wonderful to have you to prick your mind into directions that you've already talked about in the book, but also you haven't talked about in the book. So thanks a lot, Michael, once again. It's really great to have you.
All right. Well, it was really wonderful to talk about the book, and yeah, happy anytime, and best of luck.